Welcome to PwC's exclusive CFO Return to Work webinar. This is one in a series of webinars that we've held throughout this COVID period, or this period of this pandemic. We shared insights with CFOs, other C-suite executives, and clients of ours. So we really want to thank you for devoting part of your lunch, escaping from the beautiful weather that we have here in Stockholm and spending some of that with us. My name is Henrik Olsson. I will be your moderator for today, and I will also have the pleasure of having some great PwC colleagues joining me here for various bits and pieces of the agenda today, and they will introduce themselves as we move through the different sections of the webinar. And I really hope that we can have a very fruitful and open dialogue, given that there are not so many of us, so I think that will be easy to facilitate. But what we plan on doing here is spend some 60 minutes exploring some of the top priorities among CFOs and finance functions that we, as PwC, have learned in dialogues over the last couple of months, and also through the work that we're doing with CFOs across the globe. And listen to some of the reflections, what we see in terms of the different stages of this crisis, what are some of the responses, etc. And I think that my esteemed colleagues will be able to share that. And we're also looking forward to hearing some of your thoughts and perspectives on that. Please note that today's sessions will be recorded. It will also be made available after the session if you want to share it with colleagues or peers. There will be an opportunity for Q&A at the end of the webinar. And we encourage you to use the chat function to ask questions so that we can record them for the Q&A if there's something that springs to mind, so that we can address them at the end. And I will also please ask you to stay muted until the Q&A session starts at the end. If we do this efficiently, there should be about 15 to 20 minutes for Q&A at the end. So really, without further ado, I want to hand it over to you, Johan. And really, my question to you is, what economic scenarios do we see evolving, and how are different industries being affected by this crisis?
Thank you, Henrik. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Good. Just want to have a sound check. So thank you, Henrik. My name is Johan Rippe, and I'm the Clients and Markets Leader of PwC Sweden. And in addition to that, I'm also the lead audit partner on a number of engagements, mainly for listed companies. In my role as markets leader, I'm in close contacts with colleagues around the world and looking at market developments. And in order to do that, a basic cornerstone in that is to try to understand what's going on in different industries and in different geographies. And in a situation like we all experienced this spring, it's of course extremely difficult to make any forecasts even near the reliability that we normally are used to work under. Here we face a situation where it's probably correct to say that it's not possible to make any detailed forecasts. So instead, we are working with different scenarios, and that's what I hear that most of you and other companies are doing as well. And then try to understand what will the meaning be of each scenario, and what does that mean for us in order to be agile and adapt to various scenarios. So what we've done is not to try to be the forecast organization. We try to understand as much as possible what other people think, and then we challenge, analyze, and you can say accumulate what a number of different sources say to try to find what is the commonalities between these forecasts. And that's what we're going to present on a couple of busy slides here. But you will, as Henrik said, you will get this material afterwards, because it is quite detailed. But what you see on this slide is that what most people talk about is the different scenarios labeled as V, U, or L. And I'm quite sure you're all familiar with that, the V being a pretty quick return to something that we could call normal, U, a little bit more extended downturn, and L a situation where the negative impacts will be long term and only gradually and slowly return to something that we could call normal. It's of course difficult to do this on a too high level. So what we've done is to make deep dives into 16 different industries, and we've also looked at a couple of geographies for major economies. So if you are interested afterwards, you feel free to contact us, and then we can help you with material and dive into the industries that you are specifically interested in. So on this slide, you see what we've done in order to sort of define the different scenarios. And a V scenario, as I said, a pretty quick return to something called normal, could be a scenario where we have a quite limited lockdown of the communities. Let's say 1 to 2 months lockdown period, whereas a more U scenario would apply in a situation where the lockdown continue, let's say 2-3 months or something like that. And L scenario then more realistic when we have longer lockdowns periods that goes on for 5, 6, 7 months here throughout the spring and throughout the summer period. And based on that, you can say that we've already almost passed the V scenario. Most major economies in the world seem to have longer lockdown periods than just 1 to 2 months. So the more realistic scenario would be either the U or L scenario. But let's move to next slide here. And this is a very busy slide, and I appreciate that. And yeah, I will make a few just highlights here. So if you look at the U scenario for 2020, the column in the middle, and if you look for EU, the top geography here, we looked at the very high level KPIs as GDP growth and unemployment. Here you can see then a forecast of minus 8.6 in GDP for 2020 and an unemployment rate of 15.3. And then we've analyzed that for Germany, UK and US as well. And let me comment about US for a moment. It's such an important economy for the world, and it's driving a lot of the demand in the world for various goods and services. Here, the U scenario would predict then an unemployment of 12.3. And many of you may have heard the latest job numbers that came out late last week that were, I would say, dramatically more positive than the most negative ones. Just a couple of weeks ago or a month ago, people were afraid that we would see plus 20% unemployment this year in the US. And then they came down to 17, but we were still in sort of the L scenario mood. Now the latest numbers more indicate that we are in 12 to 14% or so. And it seems like when the US economy has gradually opened up in some states, that the return to work in many of those industries that were mostly affected, let's say the service industry, that return happened quite quickly. So with that said, I also heard that the Swedish forecast that our finance minister talked about yesterday indicated, I think, 6 to 7% drop in GDP. That would then almost be a V scenario for us. I'm personally a bit skeptical to that, and I know the Swedish Business Association, Svenskt Näringsliv, also is a little bit more negative. So I think we are traveling here in a U scenario overall. Let's move to next slide. And here's a slide where we distribute these very high-level forecasts to different industries. And this slide should be read in the way that on the scale going from the bottom to the top to the left, you can see the industries that are, some are even positively impacted. And those you can see at the higher end here, industries like consumer goods and retail or telecommunications. And industries that are very negatively affected are at the bottom. Not surprisingly, passenger transportations, travel, hospitality, entertainment, media, services. And then going from the left to the right, it's a scale which would indicate a higher degree of uncertainty the more to the right we move. And if we pick an industry there where there is a great uncertainty, we have automotive, for instance, and industrial manufacturing, for instance. I think that there are long-term uncertainties to what extent those will return to something that we call normal before COVID-19, depending on maybe any structural changes that this crisis will lead to. And if we take the next slide, it's a different way to plot these industries. That some industries you can say are maybe even neutrally not affected at all by COVID-19. So, for instance, agriculture, consumer goods, and retail. We know that food stores, food chains are actually having quite positive impact this spring. Telecommunications, in the way that people have more digital meetings, and the demand for broadband services have actually increased during the spring, or at least being neutral. And healthcare, overall, a neutral impact. And then all other industries are plotted here from the V scenario to a L scenario. And the L scenarios are the ones where we can expect maybe a more permanent change in how those industries will develop going forward. And everybody, of course, talks about, will the travel industry, airline industry return to what it was before? And depending on who you listen to, I think the degree of variety in views going forward is, of course, still wide. But I think all agree that there will be some permanent changes to how we travel for the foreseeable future. So with that, I think I stop there, Henrik, and we are, of course, happy to, depending on your interest, and I'm fully aware that you represent different companies from different industries. So depending on your interest, please contact us, and then we can help you go into the industries that you are interested in here. We have lots of data behind this here.
So thank you, Johan. Very insightful, and of course, as you say, this is a very complex material. It's very hard to predict, and I think we're all living in this uncertainty. Having said that, Robert, you're not going to go in and cover, I think, two different areas. One is around, what do we see across the CFO community in terms of their top priorities? Has that changed? And also, I mean, from your perspective, what measures or initiatives do you see, different CFOs and organizations takes under these different scenarios? Over to you, Robert.
Yes, thank you, Henrik, and good afternoon, good morning to everyone. A quick introduction first. So my name is Rob Smith. I'm a partner at PwC in London, and I work in our finance transformation banking team, and I'm actually the EMEA finance transformation leader. So I also do see an element of how finance is playing out across Europe as well. I also lead the largest finance transformation program currently going in financial services, which is a global finance transformation program for a very well-known bank. And therefore, I'm seeing a lot of this firsthand in the work I'm doing day to day as well. So let's start off. Henrik, I think you're driving it. As you said, what we'll do is look at how the pandemic is creating a catalyst for change and how finance best responds. I'll also give a couple of examples of how your international peers are responding to the crisis, as well as retouching on the benefits of how we respond now, if we respond in the right way. If you move forward. So in reality, what we're seeing here is a continuation of the story of disruption and how we continue to define and deliver the future of finance in the organizations we work for. And what we've always done is we've looked at the disruption that is impacting business as a whole and worked out what is finance's best response to that disruption, so that we not only in the organizations we work in survive, but actually thrive in the future. Now, quite often that disruption over the last 2, 3, 4 years has been talked around about very significant trends which unravel over a number of years. Things like urbanization, climate change, shifting global economic power to the east, etc. And then COVID-19 has come along. And if you look at it, actually, COVID-19 as a disruption has a lot in common with the types of things you see and we analysed previously. It has one key difference, though, which is the speed it has acted on us all. And to some extent, that has caught us out and thought, oh, we weren't expecting that. But in reality now, with about 3 months distance from the start of it and understanding what it means, actually a lot of how it plays through is actually philosophically quite similar to the disruption we're seeing from elsewhere. And it's a great catalyst for the changes we need to make in finance. Now, the answer is, well, what are those changes and what's our best response? And the first part of that answer is it's a continuation of our need for finance to very radically and very quickly pivot to being primarily a fast daily insight function. Now, finance traditionally also has a control function, and it also has a cost and efficiency function, and both of those are still required. But actually, the most important primary element of how finance steps up is around the pivot to rapid insight to help drive the organizations we work for. And if you think about it, can you imagine, the pain that some organizations have gone through over the last 3 months, where they have a finance function which is very backward looking, and it can't give insights into what's happening in the key dimensions of the business around revenue, around customer segments, around cost lines, around capital, around liquidity. If a CEO looks at a finance function and cannot get that information at speed, essentially you're steering blind through this pandemic. And as I said, the disruption in many ways is not entirely different to the previous disruptions we've talked around, but it's the speed that it has hit us at, which is very different, of course. Now, when I talk around the pivot to insight, it's sometimes it can mean a number of things. So just for clarity on this call, the two of the main things I'm talking about here and two of the most obvious things I'm talking around here is firstly, that dimensional view of the business. So what's happening to our customer segments, what's happening to the cost, what's happening to capital, what's happening to liquidity, what's happening to cash, the ability to see the business through those dimensions, as well as traditional ones, such as what's happening to channels, what's happening to products, what's happening to our countries and territories we operate in. So we understand and we can make the best decisions with the best fact base rapidly. But then it's also finance's ability to provide rapid driver-based scenario planning to the chief exec, the COO, etc. So that, as Johan talked around the different recovery scenarios, and of course the 1 or 2 levels of detail which go underneath that, which then look at different territories, different products, different channels, different customer groups, different supply chain implications. Finance, clearly the insight we can bring is around that very rapid driver-based scenario planning to inform the best decisions. That I think most CFOs would agree, is the best response to the COVID-19 crisis. So if we need to respond, it's very, very clear. If you flick to the next page, what you'll see is that necessity to response and how that's playing out. So the data you see here is from a global CFO survey we do at PwC, and we've done it, I think it's every 2 weeks over the last 3 months, and therefore we have quite a rich data set of what's going on. And just trying to pull out one element of that very rich data set here and how the CFOs are responding. So obviously, you know, a vast proportion of CFOs are seeing a negative revenue impact from the pandemic. And Johan did talk around, there are some industries, of course, who are doing okay out of this and some who are doing quite well. But for the majority, it's not a great outcome on the revenue line. But if you think about the response to that, only 16% have actually deferred or cancelled a lot of the transformation programs they have. Now, why is that? Well, it's because actually the benefits they're trying to get from those transformation programs, particularly this pivot to insight, the dimensional views of the business, the ability to do scenario planning, what if analysis, they're much more important than actually they previously were 3 months ago. And I'll talk in detail a little bit about some of those programs coming up in a minute. Now, of course, you know, the keen mathematicians that those that work in finance will say that 16%, you know, are deferring or cancelling, which means 84% are continuing. You know, that's the vast majority of therefore continued with those programs. And actually, if you look at that 16%, and I don't have this from the survey data, but anecdotally, from my knowledge of the programs that are going on across Europe, most of that 16% are coming in industries who are so fundamentally hit by the pandemic over the last 3 months. They're at bankruptcy or very close to bankruptcy, and therefore their decision to defer or cancel these sort of transformation programs in finance are decisions which they have no say over whatsoever. So they are the types of industries who really are possibly, or companies who are possibly going to disappear over the next 3 to 6 months anyway. So that small number is a good indicator of the super stressed organizations that we have. If we move forward. So we saw essentially 3 waves of the finance response to the crisis, and it would be very similar to the frameworks that you have seen elsewhere. The first wave, being around crisis response. Then you start looking at how you start managing the recovery from that and into positioning for the future. Now, obviously on slides, these things are always drawn as sequential and in 2 dimensions. They are not activities which are happening purely sequentially. And people started thinking around wave 3 long-term positioning very rapidly, 1 to 2 weeks into the crisis, but they're the dominant waves. And it's different in different industries and in different companies we look at. But I think broadly speaking, we could probably say with a degree of confidence that we are leaving wave 1 at present in Europe and moving into wave 2. Now, obviously, there are different scenarios where potentially we get knocked back a little bit into wave 1, depending on what happens. But at the moment, what we see is people moving into wave 2. And the thinking has started around wave 3 in terms of what the long-term response would be. And for the CFOs, as I mentioned, it's around redefining what the future of finance would be. But the underlying principle of how finance maintains the control structure, maintains the drive on efficiency, but has this decisive pivot to insight function as the primary reason for being for finance, I think continues. But CFOs are also thinking around, you know, other sets of capabilities that are required, and particularly, you know, those which help drive and navigate the organization. They are obviously looking at the people, both overall within organizations, but within finance functions, and they're looking at what skills would be required and the location of those skills. Partly that's around wave 1 type questions on things like virtual working and how much that continues into the future. But also CFOs have a very strong voice around things like nearshoring of overall operations as well. And I'll cover that slightly as we go forward as well. There's also views around operating model and processes. So you'll see on a slide coming up, you know, CFOs have a big say in supply chain procurement, and 51% in the global CFO survey are saying people are looking at alternative sourcing options. And again, the only surprise that 51% are looking at alternative sourcing options is that number is actually so low. I would imagine when we continue to rerun this global CFO survey, that percent will go up, because the dislocation in supply chains we've seen, in for example, the automotive sector, we've seen people chartering aircraft to try and fly parts from China to the UK and into Germany to keep some production going. Clearly that is going to lead to a reevaluation of those supply chains in products companies, maybe less so in service companies, but certainly the question will be asked. CFOs are also, of course, questioning the cost levels within the enterprise, but also within the finance function itself, and looking at the enablers required around things like the move to cloud technology, but also things like the skills of our workforce in order to how best define our future of finance too. The other thing that's on the CFO mind, and as important or more important than it was 3 months ago, is how best to lead that future of finance response and how to define that change. And in conversations with CFOs after the last couple of months, I think even more so than 3 months ago, the view is that just responding with a large IT program is not going to provide the benefits that is required both for finance and for the business, and that you need to lead change programs to define the future of finance either through the people, the process, or the performance lens, and have it enabled by IT and not driven by IT. If you then flick forward, Lars. So then in terms of the detail of what that response has looked like, and on the left-hand side of the page here, you'll see what we've seen CFOs concentrating on wave one. And as I say, some elements of this now are ongoing. Some are starting to draw to a close and move into the more sustainable wave two and wave three type discussions around, well, how do we redefine ourselves structurally and sustainably for the future, as well as respond to the crisis that's unfolded. But it won't surprise you that in conversations with CFOs that we've had across EMEA and globally, there is a big focus on cash, particularly on liquidity of organizations. There have been CapEx reviews that have happened very, very quickly. As you saw, 84% of people have continued their finance transformation, 16% have not. That number is different when you look at different types of CapEx. So in some areas of CapEx, that reduction has been much higher than it has been within finance transformation. And if you look at investment on a broader perspective, i.e. things like hiring, the amount that has stopped is very much higher than the 16% you've seen in finance transformation. The steering in a crisis, I've talked a lot around the ability to do scenario analysis and forecasting and the deep analysis. That's absolutely pivotal in wave one, wave two, and wave three. And if you remember one thing from this element of today's conversation, it is that ability to rapidly create scenario analysis to understand how your business has responded and how it will respond to make better decisions and support the CEO, the COO, divisional heads, etc. Finance ops, we covered, a lot of stuff around working virtually, a flexible workforce, lots of questions now around what the finance function of the future will look like in terms of the people, where they will sit, etc. There may be questions on that later on, of course. And then in the compliance area, there's quite a lot on state aid in many countries and how that impacts the organization. That's been quite a big thing. We've also seen quite a lot around, it says investor readiness there. I'm not sure why we've used the word readiness. It's really investor relations and what the response of investor relations and trying to keep companies, investors up to date. Which then, if you think on the right hand side of this, clearly we are consultants, and therefore the insight that we can provide you is partly on the macroeconomics, partly on the CFO agenda, but very much on how people have responded in terms of the programs that they're running. And broadly speaking, globally, but definitely in Europe, I think we'd put them into these three buckets of the response in terms of those programs that continued. As we said, 16% have stopped the programs, but they tend to be the organizations who are either bankrupt or very close to bankrupt, and therefore they have no choice. So the three buckets we've seen. So, some organizations had large ongoing programs, and what they did is slowed them initially as they tried to work out what was going on. But actually, most of them are now restarting and getting them back into the same sort of timelines and the same sort of investment levels as previously. So probably our second largest finance transformation program globally at the moment is the global beverage company, who did slow down for 6 weeks and then realized that actually, a critical capability for beverage companies was to understand what was happening in all of their different markets and how best to respond. And the program they were running to be able to provide that single view of data, they leverage the cloud technologies and therefore get the business benefits from, was absolutely vital. And therefore they have remobilized to exactly the same approach. Some organizations have just continued. They never even slowed. They just carried on going. So the global banking group being referenced here is the program I lead, which I say is the largest finance transformation in banking globally at present anyway. We didn't slow at all, actually. We just continued with what we were doing for the same reasons. There was obviously lots of questions around things like budgets and stuff, but essentially the work continued. There are some, though, who are looking at the programs they were running and doing a degree of reprioritizing the investments they were making in finance. So the example here is a large global sportswear manufacturer headquartered in Europe, and one of the truly large ones this is. And what they did is they reprioritized certain elements of their program, particularly around data analytics, to try and drive the predictive scenario-based planning and see how the world was unfolding so they could make better decisions as a business. And if you think about, sort of consumer fashions as being quite a fast-moving business anyway, that not only has those consumer fashions changed, but the level of change in the channels for organizations such as this one has been an unbelievably fast change, as I'm sure you're aware in both your professional roles but in your private lives as well. How we buy things like fashion is very different today than it was 3 months ago, and therefore they've reprioritized their program to recognize that and to get that benefit to the business much faster. If you then move forward, so in terms of the benefits people are getting, there are cost benefits, and you'll see those cost benefits here and some of the data we've referenced from the studies afterwards. But actually, if I was in your shoes now as a CFO or in CFO teams in Sweden or anywhere in the world right now, I would have these cost benefits of the transformation as something which is important. But if you move forward one more, I think the qualitative benefits of the transformation actually they're always usually dominant, although you need the cost base to pay for it, but they're much more dominant than they were before right now. Because, and again, I will reiterate myself without apology, that dimensional view of the business and understanding what's happening through channels, through products, through territories, to capital, to liquidity, etc., is so unbelievably important. The ability to do that with different scenarios at a high level to see how these things will fold out and be able to do it very rapidly to your CEO, COO, divisional heads, etc. That's what it's all about right now. So, we've known for many years that the finance needs to be a forward-looking function to drive insight, to help drive the business and make better decisions. But, in the period we're in right now, what we're seeing, and this really isn't a surprise to any of you on the call, is that without that capability for the dimensional views of the business with drill down, understand the scenarios and do that at speed, it's very hard to see how CEOs could be happy with the value provided by finance. It was always obvious, but COVID-19 and the pandemic has made it even more obvious, I would say. That was all I was going to say on this section, Henrik. So I will pass back to you.
I think I don't think we'll. So I think if that's it then, Robert, why don't we open up for questions from the group? Unless there's Lars, is there another section that we want to cover, or are we through the 2 sections?
I think we're fine. So okay. Let's open up for questions.
Superb. So why don't we open up for questions then? We have approximately 23 minutes left. Of course, we don't need to use all of those. I see the chat is fairly empty, so I'm hoping that the attendants, if you want to ask a question, just unmute yourself and fire off. There we go. Yeah, or you can ask questions in the chat if you want to. But while we wait, Robert and maybe Johan also, while we have you on the line, there's been a lot of talk about this moving virtually, and at least in some of the client conversations I've had, we've seen the outsourcing questions. There's been challenges with that. We've heard a lot about the virtual workforce that you don't need to have. In banking, there's a lot of talk about branches. Are we seeing people moving fully virtual, or what are the opportunities that we've seen with our clients?
Do you want me to try first, Henrik?
Yeah, sure.
So yeah, it's one of those questions which has started being asked on day one, and it's obviously being asked much more now. And we've learned a lot during the last 3 months, and I think some of this has changed. I also, strongly believe you need to be careful to avoid generalized cliche at this moment as well, because sometimes people do sort of say, well, everything's virtual, stay like that forever. I don't think that's true. I think there are different impacts in different places. So, for example, your example on bank branches, I think the move to online channels is something which has always been happening, but which will be accelerated by this. We talked to the digital head for one of Britain's largest food retailer supermarket, and he said, look, one of the things that's happened here is that I don't trust the business anymore because my move to online program over 3 years was said to be too aggressive, but we actually managed it in 2 weeks. And clearly want to maintain that going forward. In terms of the workplace for CFOs and finance, I think as well the conversation has been quite unsophisticated in many ways, and it's well, should it be virtual, should it not be virtual? I think we should look at this more in terms of the activities that we do rather than the roles which we have. And I think clearly, and this is emerging, I think clearly there are activities such as problem solving, such as understanding strategy and how we create alignment and creating team and community, which are best done in person. And there will always be the need for that. However, I think what we've learned is there are certain activities, for example, some call center type activities. There are, a lot of the meetings that we have, particularly those that involved international travel, which we have learned we can do at somewhere between, let's say, 80 to 95%. Some people argue 80 to 120% effectively virtually. And therefore, I think you will see significant changes in the pattern, but it won't be as black and white as people sometimes say, that everyone suddenly is going to just be sitting at home for the rest of their life and you can sell every single office building around the world. I think it's a more nuanced and complex story than that.
So let me any reflections from the external group that's joined us on that? Is that similar to the dialogue that you've been having internally, or is it different? Maybe everyone is busy eating lunch at the same time, so within their mouths. But so let me then ask another question, and maybe again, Robert, if you can pick that up, and let's see if somebody from the group joining us wants to pitch in. But you talked a lot about this ability, to not only have this dimensional view, but also to rapidly create these scenarios. Are there any other kind of surprising insights that you've learned or that we've seen with clients in order to strengthen the competitiveness moving forward, right? Is there anything that you were surprised with in your dialogues with clients?
Well, I was surprised with a fair amount. I mean, one of the things which was very noticeable was which organizations were ready to operate virtually versus which weren't. And, you know, you saw the mad scramble for laptops across the world and across Europe, as people who could not actually work virtually from home because they only had desktops, plus the enabling technologies people had, such as, you know, this Google meeting, etc. But, you know, the Zoom, and you know, there's so many different things out there. Some organizations, it happened really quickly. Some organizations struggled actually, and are still struggling to an extent. And it was actually a little bit of a surprise to me as to quite how variable the IT systems were ready across the different organizations, across different industries in different countries.
Excellent. Well, I mean, if there's not any, further questions, I think, let's try to round this off. I want to, thank you, Robert and Johan, for joining us, and Lars, thank you for compiling the material, and also thank you for our executives that have joined us throughout today, and also I hope that there will be plenty of listeners that have enjoyed this. I think, Lars, as we move to maybe the final slide, in terms of a summary, I think, Robert, you said it best yourself. There's two things, if you want, that we want you to take with you as we wrap this up. One is the dimensional view, in order to support, the ability to rapidly create these scenarios and support the decision making in the executive team, and really provide the CEO, COO, and maybe also the CMO with information at hand, right? And this is a direct quote from our CFO Pulse survey. So with that, again, if you have questions, there's contact details on us in the material. So please reach out if you have further questions, or if you want to continue the dialogue offline. We are, of course, here to help. And otherwise, let's wrap things up, and maybe you could go out in the sun and enjoy some lunch.
Thanks, Henrik.
Thank you, everyone.
Yeah.
Take care.
Thank you.
Yes,
Take care. Thank you.